as the floor is mine, I will start just thanking Thibault for his kind invitation. And I'm very delighted to have the opportunity to speak about the Black Sea. And actually, I'm very delighted also by the presence of very, very good friends. And I have to present, so I apologize to Askold, who is, if I check carefully, is the only one who was in Zikron Yakov a couple of years ago in 2017. And at that moment, there was a conference entitled Money on the Margins, Coinage Forms and Strategies of Intercultural Commerce and on the Black Sea Shore in the Classical Hellenistic Eras, organized by David Chaps. And we are still expecting the proceedings, but it's supposed to appear very soon, I suppose. The argument was the following: when coinage was invented, the city-states of ancient Greece adopted swiftly and enthusiastically. It's not true at all, but by the late classical period, coins were the universal medium for both internal and external trade. Not at all. Non-Greeks adopted coinage more hesitantly, if at all. But the Greeks continued to trade with their neighbors. The Greeks wrote little about the mechanism of this trade. Did the local have special trading post? Currencies that were used especially for trading with Greeks? Did Greek traders travel to the non-Greeks or the other way around? Did long-term relationships lead to the adoption of coinage by the non-Greeks? These questions involved an ocean of literature, especially considering the northern and western shores of the Black Sea. Archaeological researches have been pushed intensively, especially by Russian and Ukrainian colleagues, helped by colleagues of many other countries who have undertaken so many field excavation researches on the northern shore of the Black Sea. Bulgarian and Romanian colleagues proved to be also extremely active on the western shore. Many of them are here, were at the conference in Zikron Yakov, and to see the, let's say, the table of content of my lecture, my paper will focus on coinage, and it is entitled Money at the Margin: How to Evaluate the Role of Coinages for Intercultural Trade, the Case of the Black Sea. So not money on the margins, but money at the margin, which is a small difference, with a clear anticipation of the main consequence of the journey I will now be pleased to do with you. As you see, I first intend to remind the general frame of monetization in the Greek world, always useful, especially for a broader audience, and to putting the Black Sea into a broader perspective and not escaping the touchy question about the level of monetization. Then dealing with money at the margins, and I propose to consider what colleagues are considering for the Barbaricum in Roman times. You see that's at point 2.2, especially in Poland, due to the impulse given by Alexander Borchet. And at last, and with these models in mind, we shall go back to the Black Sea briefly, considering the many issues for the different seashores. This is an ambitious program, considering the time allowed, and it goes without saying that what follows is only a sketch of the full picture, methodological and quantified as much as it can be. So I have to manage here. It's often repeated that coinage experienced a rapid success in the Greek world. This is partly true, and by no means meteoric or overwhelming, as illustrated by a map produced by Henry Kim and often reproduced at the very end of the 6th century, near 500 BC, nearly a century and a half after the invention of coinage. This invention has spread to nearly 90 mints. As such, the map may look impressive, even more so if we had some missing mints from the northern Black Sea. But I'm skipping here. Looking at the inventory of archaic and classical poleis, this is not even 1/10 of all the duly recorded cities of the time. Even at the end of classical times, in the 330s, the proportion of cities for which at least one monetary issue is attested doesn't go far beyond 40%. For the cities located all around the Black Sea, the proportion amounts to less than 30%. It's actually 18 out of 62, as you can see. Beyond these gross numbers, reality proves to be even much more discrete. Louis Bousseau and I, and actually that's an old project, and we have not worked really during the last years. We are currently working on a detailed comparison between the numismatic evidence and the inventory of archaic and classical polis. It turns out that among the roughly 400 striking cities, most of them issued coins in a most ephemeral way, limited to 1 or 2 issues of small value on more than 2 centuries. Very few did on what could be described as a regular basis. Even for the biggest mints, it's likely that doors remain closed most of the time. The study of Greek monetary production is the study of ups and downs, generally isolated between long periods of non-activity. And what is true at the level of a min is often also true at the level of an area. So sorry, I was a bit too quick. At the level of an area, yes. Considering the Cycladic Islands, for example, we are left with a huge silver strike of various mints at the turn of the 6th and the 5th century. That's in between 520 and 480, and that's exactly the moment of Persian presence in the, as a satrapy in the area. And nearly nothing more after that, with the exception of a short renewal in the first decades of the 2nd century. This generalized ephemeral character of coin strike in the ancient Greek world has 2 major consequences. First, it's incompatible with trade as the reason why coins may have been reproduced, since trade implies a much smoother process, admitting variations but on a longer periods of time. And second, it's incompatible again with free minting, that is the possibility for any citizen to convert his precious metals into coins at the mint. But Greek royal coinages in gold and silver were mainly struck to match military expenditures, as Roman Republican coinages is accepted knowledge, which doesn't require major adjustment, and of which the royal coinage of Pontus offers the best example. While there is nearly no coinage to attribute to the long reign of Mithridates V, the father of Eupator, we are faced for Mithridates Eupator with a huge production produced during short periods of intensive strikes. At these periods could be easily connected with, all these periods could be easily connected with military expenditures. But, and that's more important, beyond gold and silver, bronze coins are now recognized as having served for military purposes. Selene Soma provide a full list of such cases, and there is much more now. It should be noted that these bronze coins brought at a specific moment for military expenditures sometimes continue to circulate very long after the end of the conditions necessary to their strike. A good example is provided by the bronzes of Seleucus II issued at Sardis, which formed the main part of the coins found at Kabylie, near the modern Yambol in Bulgaria today. And these coins first served to pay the Seleucid garrisons and were then kept into circulation at least a century after the departure of the Seleucids. But beyond, as a matter of fact, it's a rule with few exceptions that military expenditures represent by far the main motive for public expenditures. This is not only guessed for imperial Rome with at least 70% of the total for the army. It's duly recorded again and again for countries and cities of modern times. In other words, the onus of the proof rests on the shoulders of anyone who wants to argue against that rule. Yeah. Coin circulation is often revealing of a military purpose, as illustrated by the gold status in the name of Alexander's. Striking huge quantities during the last 3 decades of the 4th century, they massively found their way in northern Greece and Thrace. It's likely that they've served to pay the auxiliaries of the Macedonian king. And it is interesting to observe that gold coins in the name of Alexander quickly disappear from circulation. The pattern of hoarding after 250 indicates that these gold status quit the Greek world, going east along the seashores of the Black Sea. Among the various maps we may produce linking coin hoards with the military, the one for the Roman Empire during the years 238 to 59 is particularly striking, with a clear concentration of silver deposits along the limes. So if coinage is truly a distinctive mark of the Greek world, it was mostly ephemeral and mostly connected with military purpose. And now, a paper, some development about how monetized were Greek economies. What about the level of monetization? Literature is full of loose or firm statements about it partly monetized, fully monetized, without giving any quantified measure most of the time. What stands behind such vague statements is often an implicit desire to paint a nice portrait of a described society, taking the level of monetization as a criterion of modernity. It is important to be aware of the amount of implicit preconceived ideas surrounding such a concept. Very few are those who dare to be more precise, from the rare numbers advanced for the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and or France during the mid-18th century. It turns out that we should be well advised to never speak about full monetization. An even braver attempt has been made for the Byzantine Empire, for which Angeliki Laiou and Cécile Morisson have proposed to detail the global result of 46% of monetized transactions between the cities. That means between the cities, 80%, and the countryside, 26%, with 3/4 of the population living in the countryside. Such a calculation is interesting to keep in mind, even if difficult to endorse in the details and possibly over-optimistic. 80% of monetized transactions in town, I have my doubt. This is more, and possibly considerably more, in terms of monetized part of the GDP than the Dutch Republic at the end of the 18th century, just 1/2 of the GDP. What we have also to keep in mind is the role played by credit. Current ideas for the Imperial Roman world incline us to multiply by 2, possibly by 3, the amount of monetized cash. On another hand, modern ethnological cases indicate how difficult it was to pass from a barter economy to a monetized economy. For the introduction of a coin economy in the Kingdom of Assam in 1862, we are informed that, and you can read on the screen, I will read, the most important change that took place immediately after the British had taken over was the monetization of the economy. A poll tax of 3 rupees per paik, people were submitted to corvée labor, that is about 90% of the population, was introduced in place of a liability of personal service without changing the existing kel systems. However, this was gradually replaced by a proprietary system under which regular assessment of land based on actual measurement was held. Lands were assessed according to their brand of transition, from the use of local currencies to that of British Indian currency. The scope for currency flow was limited. A substantial portion of trade surplus generated in early 30s either accrued to traders of non-indigenous origin or represented the value of the goods received by the government in lieu of revenue. The administrative machinery was manned by people from outside the state, and of the public money that has gone to defray the establishment, civil and military, at least half has been remitted out of the province, whilst all surplus revenue above these expenses has been withdrawn to the treasuries of the government. Thus, there was an acute shortage of money during the transitional period, which in a way debarred the indigenous people from taking advantage of the opportunities that came up in the subsequent periods. I've been a bit long about that, but I think it's important to put things on the longue durée, and certainly if we are speaking about monetization, to see how even for modern period, not speaking about Byzantine, but even for modern period, and even for real recent period from in the scope of ethnology, it was still a difficult goal to achieve. Looking at the level of monetization of an economy, we clearly have to look at the range of available denominations. We are now familiar with sophisticated systems, including more than 10 denominations. We have 15 for euros, there are 13 for dollars. Such a high number of denominations was never reached in ancient times. Rome functioned with 7, a number seldom approached by the most important means of the Greek world. Especially impressive are the sets of contemporary bronze values produced in Ptolemaic Egypt. For the Black Sea, but we first need to be certain about chronologies in order not to mix issues belonging to different series. So not circulating at the same time following the definition of monetary series, Pantikapaean seems to offer an interesting case with a large set of denomination. Another important parameter to keep in mind is the feeble proportion of monetized precious metals. If, as it is very explicit in Latin, we divided the amount of gold and silver into 3 categories, the signati, the facti, the infecti, it turns out that the signati, the metal which has been stamped, means monetized, meaning the coins, argurion episemon in Greek, doesn't represent more than 20%, and actually that's a real maximum of the available precious metals, and a bit less as a rule. In other words, most of the available gold and silver was kept under the form of facti, that is manufactured items, or infecti, that is bullion or ingots. In a paper devoted to that question, I concluded, sorry to quote, the most significant conclusion of this paper is that precious metals, gold and silver, were generally speaking monetized in a feeble proportion. Monetized gold and silver failed to appear a single time in the great Hellenistic processions. When it's allowed, monetized gold and failed to appear a single time in the great Hellenistic procession. When it's allowed to know, it comes systematically well behind non-monetized gold and silver in Roman triumphs, except with Hellenistic kings, where it may reach 30%, their proportion is regularly below 10%. Monetized precious metals are not more abundant in sanctuaries like Athens, Delos, or Delphi. They represent a minimal part, 1/50th at most, as it seems, of the temple hoard of Jerusalem. It is clear, in addition, that in case of emergency, the greatest funds are provided by vessels and jewelry. End of quotation. The importance of jewelry could not be underestimated for the Black Sea area, which is well known for its famous treasures, especially the so-called Scythian and Thracian gold marvels, which have been on exhibit all around the world. It should be noticed that specular discoveries of that type could also happen on the southern shore of the Black Sea, as with a luxurious tomb found at Amisos, the modern Samsun. These objects have been mostly considered by art historians, but they were real wealth reserves whose weight could be impressive in converted into coins. The 9 gold items of the Panagiouriste hoard, that makes 6.2 kilograms, make more than 700 staters. The unique larnax of the Vergina tomb, 11 kilograms, correspond to nearly 1,300 staters. If converted into coins, both would range in the very top category of all the recorded hoards for gold coins. Behind these celebrated treasures, one is also struck by the density of such artifacts, as illustrated by the distribution map produced by Michael Streister and Friederike Fless for a specific type of jewelry. At last, it turns out that the average weight of jewelry produced in the Black Sea is generally superior to those produced elsewhere. This is true generally, and to a certain point, this is also true comparing the weights for a specific kind of jewelry. Massive gold is nearly absent in South Italian jewelry. We lack a comparative study on these questions, but it looks clear that the average thickness of gold varies from an area to another. And you see here from the average weight for different areas, but of course, the statistic for sample is very small. Now I'm pleased to pass to my next point, which is to define models for money on the margins, to define, as made clear by the word intercultural. This conference, like so many others in recent times, is about identities, but to the best of my knowledge, it is the first of its kind to consider Greek coinages along that line. Cultural identities are notoriously hard to define. It's also the historical topic for which modern political agendas use to exercise their most damaging effects. As a reaction to some distortions of huge nationalism, the academic world could be tempted to argue against any attempt of definition based on a form of essentialism. Nationalism is certainly to be fought, but one may sometimes get the feeling that the academic world, particularly in the West, is prohibiting any attempt of cultural definition as theoretically wrong and practically dangerous. Such a position is in itself dangerous, inasmuch as it deprives the historian of his role to make the past intelligible. There is a vast literature about Greeks and the so-called barbarians, a word which tends to disappear in recent literature, as everywhere, but perhaps even more clearly here than in most other contexts. Past has been hugely instrumentalized by modern politics in the Black Sea area, as reminded by Christel Müller, and I have, so that's, I think, you see other books, and here it's a quotation from Christel, who organized also a conference in Nanterre some years ago on a rather similar topic, and co-organized with Thibault. In terms of historiography, both historians and archaeologists investigating the Northern Black Sea region must turn to rational publication. Here, of course, there is the problem of ideology resulting from the view that the Russians have held and continue to hold concerning the relationships between Greeks and natives. That vision is underpinned by the perception that Soviet power had concerning the integration of the different nationalities within the USSR. More recently, it has been affected by the disintegration of the Russian Empire, a situation akin to decolonization and accompanied by the sense of loss that results from the process. But that's for USSR and Russia today, but there are similar movement in the West. As a result of this viewpoint, we can see two lines of thought. One is a real sensitivity to the idea of acculturation, the best example in our subject area being what is usually called Greco-Scythian art. The other, a hardening of identity, rather recent, evolves the desire to preserve the Greekness of the Greeks, the unicity, to paraphrase Jonathan Hall. In other words, the view that the Greeks of the Black Sea are first and foremost Greeks, and the colonies established by them are distinguished by cultural features that are purely Greek. This last idea appears to be the transposition into the field of ancient history of a very nationalistic view of ethnic identity, which is largely predominant in contemporary Russia, where the preservation of Russianness and request for the genophont genetic stock is a pervasive political concern. End of quotation. To be sure, this debate is not typical for Russia. The difficulty not to make too strong the line between what has been presented so far as different ethnicities is apparent everywhere, and it's likely that the recent regain of nationalism in various places along the Black Sea area creates a context for corrupted narratives. After others, the much regretted Black Sea Center in Aarhus did very well to promote a balanced view on these touchy questions, organizing a conference entitled The Meeting of Cultures in the Black Sea Region Between Conflicts and Coexistence. We all know that identities We all know that identities are multiple and changing, and that the definition of the self is, as a rule, built by the other. For many anthropologists, an allegedly true identity is stacked between the active identity for the others and the passive identity by the others is not an object of inquiry, for the simple reason that such a thing is simply out of reach of our knowledge. For the Black Sea, several recent studies where I am here, for the Black Sea, several recent studies have concentrated on these questions with a growing interest for how to interpret material culture, what is typically Scythian alteration. Doing so, it's necessary to be aware about practices and ways of thinking themselves inscribed in a broader political context, which may subvert the interpretation. Same cautiousness should also be exercised for academic strategies in context less under political pressure. In addition, and as you can see, I have slides which are not really related directly, but which are illustrating my point. In addition, monetary history doesn't escape the danger of modern biases due to dominant economic thinking, the economic zeitgeist. To a certain point, the very focus on private strategies, microeconomy, or public policies, macroeconomy, has always mirrored political options. It didn't happen randomly if, for Ptolemaic coinages, studies focus on bimetallism before World War I, for monetary inflation in the 1930s, and for closed economies during the second half of the 20th century. At last, a final word of caution back to identities, but applied to coins. As for other artifacts, the fact to find some specific coinage in an archaeological context, a grave, for example, doesn't mean that the buried person shared the identity of issuing power, as proved by many cases in recent times, for which we do have positive evidence. During the peninsula, but that's possibly, just, we have time, just to see, yeah, that's that point. During the Peninsular War in Napoleonic times, for example, we are informed that waiting for departure in Portsmouth, English soldiers were only paid in Spanish dollars, while, that's the first quotation, while in Spain, the pockets of a dying French soldier only contained Spanish and British money. So it's exactly the opposite of what could appear at first sight. Sorry, the other way. The Northern Roman Barbaricum, before to make a grand tour of the Black Sea, something about the Barbaricum. Before to make a quick grand tour of the Black Sea, considering intercultural trade from a monetary perspective, it may be helpful to keep in mind what colleagues have achieved about the Roman Barbaricum, inasmuch as the general issue doesn't vary too much. It's worth starting reminding that what Tacitus tells us about the Germans in an often quoted passage of his Germania, and we can read together, silver and gold the gods have refused to them, to the Germans. Whether in kindness or in anger, I cannot say. I would not, however, affirm that no vein of German soil produces gold or silver, for who has ever made a search? They care but little to possess or use them. You may see among them vessels of silver, which have been presented to their envoys and chieftains, held as cheap as those of clay. The border population, however, value gold and silver for their commercial utility and are familiar with, and show preference for, some of our coins. The tribes of the interior use the simpler and more ancient practice of the barter of commodities. They like the old and well-known money, coins milled or showing a two-horse chariot. They likewise prefer silver to gold, not from any special liking, but because a large number of silver pieces is more convenient for use among dealers in cheap and common articles. End of quotation. A feast for the anthropologist, this passage introduces us at once with coinage conceived in a non-economic perspective. We owe to Alexander Burche and his team, Renata Czerlek and Ania Zapolska, to have renewed our knowledge about Roman coins found in the Barbaricum, particularly in Poland. First coin appears as the most common export north of the Carpathian Mountains. With an estimate total of 70,000 items, Roman coins are about 200 times more numerous than vases in terrae sigillatae or bronze or glass vessels. Second, at the difference of their functions inside the Roman Empire, coins are no more all-purpose money, with the three functions of unit of account, storage of wealth, and means of exchange, as defined by Karl Polanyi and others. Instead, once in the Barbaricum, Roman coins were for special purposes in a prestige gift exchange economy, used as a mean of payment in socially or politically motivated transactions like payments of tribute, ransoms, blood money, or dowries. It is remarkable that coins are often found with precious metals being infected, as silver or facti. Moreover, their importation beyond the limits is only poorly associated with trade. Alexander Bourchier has convincingly put forward the case of the great quantities of array of Trajan Decius and his immediate predecessors, which are found in great numbers between the southern Baltic seashores and Ukraine. He comments, all the array are pierced above the head of the emperor, and some were deliberately chopped into fragments prior to deposition. This treatment of gold coins is not noted elsewhere in Barbaricum or within the Roman Empire. The coins described here are quite certain to be the remains of plunder taken by the Goths, and after their defeat of the Romans at Apretus, that's in Bulgaria, in 251. It's very likely that the entire imperial treasure was captured by the Gothic troops. And Bourchier adds, the chopping of the coins into fragments prior to their deposition, that is, a de facto destruction of the enemy portraits and annihilation of this power, shows that they must have been a part of the plunder. Where I am, yeah, sorry. That the arrival of Roman coins in the Barbaricum was not primarily linked with trade is an opinion now commonly shared. For Ukraine, Boris Magomedov argues that these coins, and I'm quoting, penetrated by different routes, bulk payments, subsidies, ransom, money, mercenary fees, etc., issued to barbarian chiefs by the Roman administration, were in high-grade silver denarii of old issues. This coinage could hardly have originated from sources other than government treasure, as they had already been taken out of circulation within the empire. Current coinage could have reached the Cherniakiv area by other routes. For example, the barbarian soldiers would have received the money as payment for service in Roman provinces. Coins at different denominations also enter the barbarian territory. Barbarian territory during the wars as booty. Trade exchange could not possibly have been a source of major revenue in coins, since generally it was based on barter. For the Greek coins found in the Barbaricum, Marius Milcharek has produced an interesting inventory. That's Boris Magomedov, and here I am. An interesting inventory. One important difficulty for such kind of enterprise is to determine at what time these Greek coins were brought far from their production area. As Mark Barr for Belgium, he had to exclude from his record modern imports of old coins, among which the truly fantastic art of Athenian Wapenmünzen found at Shubin, but in fact imported at the end of the 19th century. To sum up what I've tried to argue so far, we have seen that the production of coinage in the Greek world was an ephemeral phenomenon. Most cities never minted civic coins, and very few of those which did it on a more or less regular basis. But coinage, that's one point. That second point, that coinage was produced for public expenditures, which means military expenditures in nearly all societies prior to the 19th century, and that to speak of a monetized economy is an exaggeration, which is more misleading than helpful. On a methodological point of view, we have to keep ourselves on our guard, since nationalism is always infecting the question of identities, while on a practical level, colleagues dealing with the Roman Barbaricum tend to agree that these coins were exported mostly through channels not related to trade. What I intend to do now is, the last part of my paper is to review the different seashores of the Black Sea from a monetary point of view, and starting with east, modern Georgia, and turning clockwise. Literature on these, and so you have here some basic thing. So Pontus Euxenos, as we are here. Literature on these questions is gigantic. Let us remind that in their chapter devoted to West and North Pontic numismatics, Ulrike Peter and Vladimir Stolba managed to gather nearly 700 entries for 5 years. And that was the years between, as you see, 2008 and 2013, and they did again very recently for our big Congress in Warsaw last September. My presentation aims to keep with some major methodological issues. Keeping the difficulties for the end, it's convenient to start with the East. Among the rare nations described by Strabo as making no use of money, we find actually two: the Lusitanians, so the extreme west of Europe, in Portugal now, and the Albanians of the Caucasus. And you see, they are straightforward, not like shopkeepers. They do not, in general, use coinage, and no number greater than 100, but make exchanges through barter. End of quotation. The quotation is interesting since it firstly underlines that coinage was of common use everywhere else, but not here. Okay, just I have to. The statement may find confirmation looking at the numismatic evidence. In a paper entitled Trade on the Black Sea, a forerunner of the Great Silk Road, Otar Lorkipanidze produced a distribution map, which, how incomplete it may appear nowadays, indicates how coins were rarely found and then only on the seashore. That's for coins, you see. That's a same feeling of feeble monetary use emerged from the study of the coins themselves. It's remarkable that the coins found in the necropolis of Pishnari were old or pierced, which mean, in a way, demonetized, just used for the value of a metal. However, Georgia is also the well-known land of the Golden Fleece, as attested by some spectacular discoveries of jewelry. And as already mentioned, it's also the place where substantial amounts of gold statues of Alexander the Great were found. But as it has been argued later in Roman period, it's unlikely that these coins were channeled to Georgia or Armenia through trade. The south. The southern seashore is entirely included in modern Turkey and was mainly formed in classical times by the Kingdom of Pontus, with the two big cities of Amissos and Sinope. Under Academic rule, these two means were responsible for a large production of silver sigloi, with nothing below these large silver coins, no small silver denominations and no bronze. It is hard to see how such a coinage could have been used for the daily transactions on a market. Quite the contrary. It is most likely that these coins issued on the Persian weight standards, not heavy Attic drachms, as still sometimes repeated in the literature, they are really sigloi, were pseudo-civic coins produced for the needs of the Persians and the Persians' army, actually. All the more, since we know from the pseudo-Attic Aristotle that Persian satraps or karanoi, the chief commanders, could requisition a civic mint in order to strike coins for the army. Here you have three different and some quantification. It's a work I started a very long time ago, and still in progress, I would say, but actually I've not worked on that since many years. You have this famous quotation by the pseudo Aristotle: Datames the Persian, and again, it's a wonderful quotation because it's really coinaging movement. It's really more anthropological. That time, as the Persian, having soldiers under his command, could supply their daily needs from the enemy countries, but having no money to give them and being requested to pay them, when the time came at which it was due, he devised the following plan. He called together an assembly and told them that he had no lack of money, but that it was in a certain place which he named. He therefore moved his camp and started to march thither. Then, when he was near the place, he went in advance to it and took from the temples there all the embossed silver plate which they contained. He then loaded his mules so that the silver plate was visible, and they looked as though they were carrying silver, and continued the march. The soldiers, when they saw it, thought that the loads were all solid silver and were encouraged, thinking that they would receive their pay. But Datames told them that he must go to Amisus and have the silver minted. Now the journey to Amisus was one of many days and exposed to the weather. So all the time, this time, he made use of the army, merely giving them their rations. So he failed to pay them, really. The fact is that we do have Siglo of Sinope, not Amisus, struck with the types of the city, but the name of Datames in Greek letters, Datamas, as well as other Persian names in Aramaic letters. However, most varieties struck in Sinope and Amisos present Greek names related to local prosopography. They are a good example of a so-called Canada Dry effect. It means pseudo-civic mints. That Siglo struck in the area cannot be invoked in favor of a monetized economy is shown by the Küçükköy ord, whose coins have been massively chiseled as a sign of distrust for the metallic content. You see that it has been published by Edward T. Newell, and most of them are really chiseled. And these continue to be the case later, as with a large hoard of Kirzle buried in around 230 BC near Amasya. Out of the 822 coins of its content, 6336, that means more than 75%, have been chisel cut. This argues for, and that's the only hoard we do have for the area. So it's a very poorly monetized, and when we do have coins, they have been chiseled. This argues for a poorly monetized area at the time where coins, even Alexander's, were accepted for the value of a bullion only. If considering the accepted dates for bronze coinage all around the Black Sea, Pontus appears as a very late player, remaining mute till the very end of the 2nd century BC. Still, the bronze coinages struck under Mithridates Eupator are another example of clear Canada Dry effect. It's really the pseudo-civic. These are, again, pseudo-civic issues struck at different times in the name of a dozen of different mints. There are two important points to observe. First, they share the same types, whatever the city. The second, they are sometimes struck in the names of a fortress, as Tolara or Pimolica, which were never even villages, even Komai. It would be entirely misleading to take these coins as bronzes issued by the cities to ease internal transactions. They were struck instead at a royal level to pay for the troops, likely to be stationed garrisons. The Pontic bronzes have been found in great quantities in the Bosporan kingdom, most likely for the same purpose, paying Pontic garrisons. The monetary landscape suddenly changes going further west. So I have to going further west. Already in the beginning of the 4th century, Xenophon observed that the first city where soldiers could make use of the coins was Heraclea. From the cities of Cromna and Sesamos onwards, we enter into a zone, and that's the next. You see, Heraclea and Sesamos. We enter into a zone which was much more familiar with coinage and where bronzes issues have been struck since the end of the 4th century. Such a greater familiarity implies more mints and more denominations, but possibly not a greater production than the pseudo-civic or military mints of Sinope and Amisus. It should be noticed that none of these Paphlagonian or Bithynian civic mints are characterized by what could be described as a stable production. Quite the opposite. Their issues appear to have been sporadic and rather exceptional. And now we are moving to the West. How to qualify the Western pontic shores? As already underlined, and due to the combined effort of generations of Bulgarian, Romanian, Ukrainian, and Russian colleagues, the literature is from now onwards truly large, if not gigantic. I shall limit myself to pinpoint some phenomena which look interesting to comment. Let's start late with the coinage in the name of Alexander the Great. We have seen that gold status in his name found massively their way into Thrace and beyond along an axis going northeast and north. Yanis Turatoglu produced distribution maps both for gold and silver. Here we see that the areas slightly differ with, for silver, two zones of higher concentration, out of which one located rather deep in the hinterland in what is modern Romania. This kind of pattern is calling for a commentary. Even better, if linked with other types of artifacts as gold diadems, or amphorex stamps, or vases. What certainly calls for comments what certainly calls for, what certainly calls for comments are the hundreds of hoards of late Hellenistic tetradrachms found in modern Bulgaria and Romania. These hoards number to roughly 500 and are usually mixing tetradrachms in the name of the Thadians and the Maronitans, Thassos and Maronea, with other tetradrachms clearly struck by the Romans in the name of the first Maris of Macedonia or Aeschylus. These hoards count for about 1/10 of the about roughly 5,000 hoards recorded so far for the entire Greek world, I mean from Spain to Indus and from the 6th century or even 7th century to the end of Hellenistic time. This is the most dramatic pattern of hoarding for the full Greek world, lato sensu. While the explanation for such a massive phenomenon could still evoke trade or slaves, wine, force, there is a firm consensus now that these coins have been issued to pay Roman auxiliaries. But, oh, sorry. But why so many hoards were left unrecovered? Part of the explanation lies in their compositions. Looking at the number of coins in these hoards, which is normally a tricky game, but is here simplified by the size of the samples. We are playing with hundreds of hoards. It appears that a substantial proportion of them do contain a multiple of 20, 40, 60, 200, 400, 600, more than 10, 50, 100, 500. It may well be the case, I'm prudent here, that a significant part of these hoards are the final payment of Thracian auxiliaries received at the end of a service, and that back home they immediately buried these monetized silver as a storage of value, which were left untouched and never enter into commercial circuits. This, of course, strongly argues for the limited character of monetizations in Thrace at that time. It's not because you have money, you have coins that it's monetized. In other words, these large Thasian type tetradrachms were quickly deprived from their status of all-purpose money to play the role of special purpose money, to quote the classical terminology created by or used by, popularized by Karl Polanyi. For the use of Greek coins in the Cora, we do have now the large database built by Adrian Munteanu, which comprises more than 5,600 coins for the mint of Istros and Calatis, and making a distinction between hoards and isolated finds, but also, crucially, between areas. Munteanu is in measure to deeply revise the accepted views. He writes, a recent review of the numismatic discoveries in pre-Roman Dacia demonstrates that by the early 1st century BC, the existence of a monetary economy and therefore of a monetary movement cannot be concretely supported. The French trade was undoubtedly very intense and rich with the Greek trade partners, as evidenced by the archaeological finds, and was based on the practical exchange of goods, that means barter. In most cases, the penetration ways of Pontic coins in the local environment are non-commercial, and in order to recognize them, we must appeal to different categories of sources. Generally, following the written records, we try to identify some possible ways by which the Greek coins could have got into the hands of barbarians, into brackets. The first one is the amounts paid on the basis of agreements concluded with the barbarian peoples. Second, large amounts of money reach the barbarian environment by compensating by the military benefits in the Hellenistic period, the mercenary being considered a real economic sector. Thirdly, the ransom of captives could be done by the city itself, but most often it involves private initiatives. Fourth, robberies also include valuable monetary pieces, even if it is nowhere mentioned explicitly. Fifth, the diplomatic actions of cities consist probably in gifts as well, some of them even in the form of money given to local chiefs in order to gain their goodwill. And sixth, another aspect that should be taken into consideration is the mobility of people living in the Pontic area who are reaching north of the Danube with various affairs. This is a very refreshing view, contrasting with some excesses of the past literature about the level of monetization reached in the hinterland of the Greek cities installed on the seashore. It is not question to deny that an important trade took place in emporia located in inner places, and the sites excavated near Vetren, being pisteros or not, has revealed ample evidence for that kind of trade. And the inscription found nearby is full of references to the merchants and poritae, but we may well wonder if it was monetized or not. Back to the coastal Greek cities, and to stick with large quantified evidence, it has to be noticed that coins were rare in burial context. 1 grave out of 52 in Callataÿ, 20 graves out of 650 in Apollonia Pontica, and 4 graves out of 40 in Istros. It is doubtful if we are entitled to interpret this as a sign of low monetization. Probably not, but at least it is not encouraging us to think on the other direction. And finally, the north. Last but not least, the northern shores of the Black Sea. Let's start, and I'm very glad I've seen the presence of Valentina, and I'm delighted by your presence, Valentina. Let's start with gold and the inscription of Boris Stanis, where it said, last quotation, the import of and the export of any kind of coin, gold and silver is permitted. Anyone who wishes to sell or to buy coin, gold or silver is to sell and buy it on the stone in the meeting place of the assembly. If anyone buys or sells it elsewhere, he is to be put on trial. And if found guilty, the seller is to forfeit the silver which has been sold and the buyer the price which he paid for it. All selling and buying is to take place in the currency of the state, in the bronze and the silver of the city of Olbia. If any sale of purchase take place in any other currency, the seller is to be deprived of whatever he is selling, and the buyer of the price he pays for it. And those who buy the contract for law breakers shall extract the penalty from those who have offended against the decree when they have duly convicted them. It is to be permitted to buy or sell gold, the citizen stater at 10 or 11.5 staters, and on no account at a higher value or greater price, and other gold and silver coinage of all kinds at any rate satisfactory to both the parties concerned. No tax is to be levied either on the sale or on the purchase of coin, gold, of silver, and of quotation. So while it was compulsory in Olbia to use only silver and bronze coins of the city. Such was not the case for gold, where Cyzicines, that the electrum status with a type of Cyzicus, are quoted first. Gold statues of Cyzicus have been indeed found in many places along the northern and western seashore of the Black Sea, as with a spectacular Myrmekian hoard, a big hoard of 100 statues. Notice the round number, just 100, recovered in regular archaeological excavations. Waiting for the completion of a PhD, I have no recent news about Evgeny Sakharov, which will provide, but Askell should know, will provide us a complete view on this phenomenon. I would like to emphasize on some point presented in Jerusalem in 2012 in a paper which is now appeared, that was about gold coinage, electrum coinage, sorry. The celebrated variety of types of the Cyzicines is likely to be the consequence of some monopolistic status. Monetary matters are first based on trust. Any change of type is consequently a perturbation for the consumers. Only monopolistic situations, as with Mytilene and Phocaia or the Roman Republican denarii, afford the possibility of continual changes. Second, although no literary evidence points to the fact, it seems unlikely that the city of Cyzicus would have been allowed to strike to its own profit only such an international coinage, especially since the city was constantly under the rule either of Athens or the Persians. I strongly doubt, but I wonder, and I'm not the only one, that it was also with some benefit for the city of Cyzicus, but it was struck on a higher level and with certainly, or most likely, the permission, let's say that in brackets, of the Persians and the Athenians for a while. Third, my third point is Cyzicines have been constantly reported as a trade coinage for transaction of high value. It is not question. Next slide. It is not question to deny that they have played such a role as indicated by the Borysthynes inscription, but as we are repeatedly informed by Xenophon, Cyzicines were greatly used to pay troops. And fourth, the production of the Cyzicines has been spread on nearly 2 centuries by Fritze, Gregling and the others on the implicit and most likely wrong assumption that each type corresponds to a year. A close inspection of the evidence doesn't support that chronology. It's likely that much of that Cyzicines issues were struck in a shorter and later period of time, sometimes in the first thirds of the 4th century, so in between 400 and the arrival of Alexander the Great. At least it should be observed that gold coins too may leave the monetary world, as shown by several studies by Michael Abramson for the peninsula of Taman in or around Phanagoria. Cyzicene chisel cut on its 2 faces with a cross on the main type, which looks like a mark of cancel, or a stater of Azander pierced and inscribed with a graffiti, which may refer to some sacrifice, or the habit, to insert a coin as a central decorative element in jewelries. For silver and bronze issues, I will focus on the contacts with the Scythians, but some points deserve to be made, however, about the production in the area. First, it's a world full of coins, as evidenced by dye studies and recovered coins. Hellenistic times in particular are characterized by an abundance rarely got elsewhere. For Bosporus, the Museum of Kerch do possess several hordes of thousands of coins. Yeah, just possibly a small development here. So we have seen that Bulgaria and Romania are the places where the biggest concentration of Greek coin hoards have been found ever. There is no place in the Greek world, not in Greece, not in Turkey, not in the Levant, not anywhere else with such a high concentration of hoard, but in Bulgaria and Romania at the very end of the 2nd century and the first, let's say, 3 decades of the 1st century. That's something really remarkable. But the same kind of exceptionality is also true for the Black Sea area, and that's for bronze coins. Of big hoards of bronze coins I know of no literature putting that into perspective. It is really worthwhile to say that it's unique. So you can have one big hoard of bronze coins, but not a dozen, as it is the case for these areas. So it's really something special there. The core of Phanagoria, I think I've, sorry, I'm just out of here. Yeah. The core of Phanagoria alone provides myriads of bronze coins, while her hoard found of, and that's it here. I know I'm again zoomies. While her hoard found in 2013 near Gorgipia now supersedes all the others with more than 21,000 coins. There is no other there is no such a hoard in the full Greek world elsewhere. Among the huge mass of local bronze coins, mostly from Ponticapéum, we find a small residual percentage of French coins. It is better not to over-interpret as witnessing some commercial routes. I think it's a danger here because you have a mass, it's a residual, and who goes? But I will not argue I will not go too far in the direction just to link that or to say, oh, you have some kinds of kiosks, so it should be a trade with kiosks and so forth. Second, it's a world full of small coins, and that from the very beginning, as demonstrated by the regretted Nina Frolova for the archaic and early classical times. At the difference of what has been said for Pontus, the northern shores of the Black Sea made extensive use of small silver fractions and very little of high denominations corresponding to a drachm or more. The die study made by Sergei Kovalenko for late classical Chersonesus offers similar results. The combination of these two patterns, a lot of coins and a preference for small coins, clearly makes a difference with the other areas in terms of monetizations of the daily life. Third, a rather large literature has been devoted to what is called the monetary crisis of the turn of the 4th and 3rd century BC. One then observes concomitant phenomena which are usually taken as characteristic of a monetary crisis. A debasement of the alloy coupled with ample countermarking and overstriking. While one can express doubts about the general interpretation as the signs of a real economic crisis, it is fascinating to observe how explanation have evolved for what constitutes a true historiographic object in itself. Nowadays, it's no more the bad barbarians, meaning the Scythians, who are all responsible for such a crisis, but a set of several factors, including climate deterioration. And on another hand, numismatic evidence outside, and that's it. Yeah. So on another hand, numismatic evidence outside the Greek cities remains scanty most of the time. The intensive excavations at Banskoye in the far northern core of Chersonesus have only yielded 75 coins, most of them from Chersonesus. The monumental structure, U6, likely to have been used for trade, has only revealed the presence of 9 bronze coins to compare with 142 amphora stamps for a total excavated surface of more than 1,000 meters square. In other words, it means that 1 coin for every excavated nearly 50 meters square. This is an extremely modest result to compare with what has been found at the house of Dionysos in Paphos, proportionally 16 times more, or at the house of a comedian in Delos, but 35 times more. But these comparisons are very difficult, and I will certainly not push that case too much. Looking at the case looking at coins in burial context, there is no coin at Banskoye. This is hardly surprising, since coins are very rare in graves of Greek cities too. For all the other rich evidence gathered by Jan Jarl Pedersen only yield 8 coins, an insignificant number to compare with vases. We do have nearly 200 coins, vases. We have just 8 coins, and we have much more vases or jewelry, rings or necklaces. And that's time for my conclusion. It's time to conclude this too short summary grand tour of the Black Sea, leaving aside many issues to be sure, among which the debate about the arrowheads as monetary objects, and I did later a paper in Constanza about that. What emerged first is the contrast of an area whose 4 cardinal points offer 4 different models, while as any sea, the Black Sea facilitated exchanges of different types for people living around its shores. Such doesn't seem to be the case from a monetary point of view under current scholarship. To caricature, we are left with 4 different monetary paradigms, speaking about coinage and trade. No coinage in the east, that's Colchis, Georgia now, nothing for trade in the south, Pontus, a balance between commercial and military in the west, Thrace, and mostly commercial in the north, Borysthenes, Chersonese, and the Bosporan Kingdom. Putting the Black Sea into large monetary perspective, both geographically and historically, it turns out that we do have to step down with 2 ideas which have been pushed too far by the past. First, the idea of fully monetized economies for the coastal Greek cities, and the idea of a highly monetized trade of these cities with the hinterland. As elsewhere, we have to take more into account the possibility that civic issues were in fact pseudo-civic issues struck for military purposes, as it is all too clear for the Bosporan Kingdom under Mithridatic rule. And all around the Black Sea, we have many signs that, once arrived in the Kora, coins were no more all-purpose money, but mainly storage of wealth. Not money on the margins, but coins at the margin first, with due caution not to make the pendulum going too far in that direction.